The North Atlantic, early 1942. The ocean is not just water, it is a killing field. Every single night, the horizon burns. British and American merchant ships, carrying the fuel, food, and steel necessary to keep the Allied war machine alive, are being slaughtered at an industrial rate. The statistics are terrifying. Nearly 400,000 tons of Allied shipping are sent to the bottom of the ocean every single month. Britain is roughly 12 weeks away from starvation. The lifeline between the United States and the United Kingdom is being severed, ship by ship, sailor by sailor. The architects of this destruction are the Grey Wolves, the German U-boats commanded by Admiral Dönitz. They are winning the war because they possess a tactical advantage that the Allies, for all their battleships and bombers, cannot figure out how to break. That advantage is darkness. To understand why the Battle of the Atlantic was nearly lost in 1942, you have to understand the physics of the German Type 7 U-boat. Contrary to popular belief, these were not true submarines. They were submersible torpedo boats. They were slow and blind underwater, crawling at a few knots, their electric batteries draining rapidly. But on the surface, they were predators, fast, agile, and deadly. And they owned the night. Under the cover of darkness, U-boat commanders would surface to recharge their batteries and run their diesel engines, racing ahead of slow-moving Allied convoys to set up ambushes. They were invisible. The vast expanse of the Bay of Biscay, the transit route from Nazi-occupied France to the Atlantic hunting grounds, became known as the Valley of Death. The Royal Air Force, RAF, Coastal Command was tasked with stopping them. They had the aircraft, rugged Vickers Wellingtons, and consolidated Liberators. They even had a secret weapon, the ASV Mark II radar, a technological marvel capable of detecting a surfaced submarine from 10 miles away in pitch blackness. Theoretically, the RAF should have been wiping the U-boats off the map. In reality, in 1941, despite thousands of patrol hours and hundreds of radar contacts, RAF Coastal Command managed to sink exactly one U-boat in the Bay of Biscay. 1. The reason for this failure was a cruel technological paradox known as the final mile. The radar worked perfectly at long range, but as the aircraft descended toward the target, the radar return would get lost in the sea clutter, the noise of waves reflecting the signal. At approximately 1 mile from the target, the radar screen would go blind. The pilot was left flying a heavy bomber at 140 miles per hour, 50 feet above the water, in absolute darkness, trying to spot a low-profile conning tower with the naked eye. It was impossible. By the time the aircraft was close enough to see the U-boat, the German lookouts had already heard the engines. They would crash dive. The time between a pilot visually spotting a submarine and the submarine vanishing beneath the waves was roughly 30 seconds. The radar blind spot gave the Germans 60 seconds. The math was simple, and the math was losing the war. The experts at the Air Ministry, the engineers with PhDs, and the strategists with ribbons on their chests declared the problem unsolvable. They wrote reports stating that night attacks on surfaced submarines were technically unfeasible. They recommended focusing on defensive convoys and accepting that the night belonged to Germany. But in a drafty, unauthorized workshop at the edge of RAF Chivener in Devon, a middle-aged squadron leader with no engineering degree and a reputation for being difficult was about to prove every expert in Britain wrong. His name was Humphrey Lee. Humphrey Lee was not your typical hero. He was 44 years old, a relic from a different era. He had flown canvas biplanes in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War, survived the peace, and rejoined the RAF when Hitler invaded Poland. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a physicist. He was a personnel officer, a job usually reserved for men deemed too old or too useless for combat. But Lee possessed two dangerous qualities: an obsession with mechanical tinkering and a complete inability to respect the word impossible. While his fellow officers drank in the mess hall, lamenting the U-boat menace, Lee sat in hangars surrounded by scavenged car headlights, aircraft landing lamps, and piles of wiring, sketching diagrams on the back of requisition forms. Lee understood the problem differently than the scientists. They saw an electronic failure. Radar couldn't hold the lock. Lee saw a lighting failure. He realized that since they couldn't fix the radar blind spot, they had to fill the gap with something else. He calculated that if a pilot could turn night into day for just a few seconds at the precise moment the radar failed, the U-boat crew would be blinded, frozen in shock, and vulnerable. He didn't need a better radar. He needed a spotlight. But not just any spotlight. He needed a beam of such intensity that it could illuminate a target from a mile away, mounted on an aircraft that barely had enough electrical power to run its own radios. When Lee presented his initial concept to the engineering board, he was laughed out of the room. The technical objections were valid and overwhelming. First, a standard searchlight required a generator the size of a truck. Putting one on a plane would make it too heavy to fly. Second, the power draw would fry the aircraft's electrical system instantly. Third, the aerodynamics of hanging a massive light bucket under the fuselage would destabilize the plane, likely causing it to crash. The chief engineer of the Coastal Command Development Unit, CCDU, told him flatly, "Lee, you are trying to violate the laws of physics and the laws of the Air Ministry simultaneously. Give it up." Lee nodded politely, left the meeting, and went straight back to his workshop to build it anyway. He became a scavenger. He stole parts from wrecked cars. He bartered for industrial batteries. He bypassed the aircraft's generator entirely, designing a bespoke, terrifyingly heavy battery pack that sat in the bomb bay, dedicated solely to the light. He engineered a retractable dustbin turret that could be lowered into the airstream only when needed, solving the aerodynamic drag issue. Inside this turret, he mounted a 24-inch carbon arc searchlight, the kind used on battleships, capable of outputting 22 million Candlepower. It was a monstrosity. It was dangerous. It added 800 pounds to the aircraft and forced the crew to leave 4 depth charges behind to save weight. It was also completely illegal. By May 1942, Lee had a working prototype mounted on a Vickers Wellington bomber. He called it the Leigh Light. His commanding officer called it a court-martial waiting to happen. The base commander threatened Lee with disciplinary action for wasting government resources and modifying His Majesty's aircraft without authorization. The pressure was mounting. Allied ships were sinking, men were drowning in oil-slicked waters, and Lee was fighting a war against his own bureaucracy. He needed a miracle. He got one in the form of a confrontation. Discovered conducting unauthorized ground tests, Lee was summoned to the station commander's office. He was given an ultimatum: stop this nonsense immediately or face a formal inquiry. Lee, standing at rigid attention, played his final card. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "I request permission for one operational test flight. One. If it fails, I will dismantle the device with my own hands, return the aircraft to standard configuration, and resign my commission. But if I am right, we can stop the slaughter in the Atlantic." Perhaps it was Lee's intensity, or perhaps it was the sheer desperation of the war effort, but the commander relented. "One flight," he barked. "You break that plane, Lee, and I'll see you in prison." On the night of June 3, 1942, Wellington aircraft serial number ES-986 taxied onto the runway at RAF Chivener. At the controls was squadron leader Jefferson Gresswell. In the co-pilot seat sat an Australian, Pilot Officer Alan Triggs. In the back, huddled over the primitive radar screen, was the operator. And beneath the fuselage, retracted and hidden, hung Humphrey Lee's career-ending invention. The crew was skeptical. They knew the rumors, that the light would blind them, that the batteries would explode, that the drag would stall the plane. They were flying a suicide mission for a madman's science project. They headed out over the Bay of Biscay, into the ink-black void. For hours, they droned through the darkness, the monotony broken only by the static of the intercom. Then, at 0217 hours, the radar operator's voice cracked with tension. "Contact. 10 miles. Dead ahead." Greswell tightened his grip on the yoke. "Combat stations." The Wellington began its descent. This was the moment of truth, the final mile. They dropped to 50 feet above the crashing waves, flying blind instruments. The radar blip grew stronger, then, as expected, vanished into the sea clutter. They were now in the blind spot. In a standard attack, this was where the pilot would strain his eyes against the darkness, usually seeing nothing until it was too late. But tonight was different. "Range?" Greswell asked. 1 mile, half mile, quarter mile, the navigator counted down, sweating over his charts. "Now!" Greswell flipped the switch. There was no warm-up, no flicker. The effect was instantaneous and violent. 22 million candlepower of pure, white synthetic daylight erupted from the belly of the bomber. The beam cut through the humid Atlantic air like a physical solid. And there it was. Caught in the brutal glare was the Italian submarine Luigi Torelli. It was magnificent and terrifying. The crew was on deck, lounging by the conning tower, completely unaware. In the harsh light, they looked like statues, frozen in a tableau of panic. They shielded their eyes, blinded by this artificial sun that had appeared from the heavens. They couldn't run to the deck guns. They couldn't scramble down the hatch. They were paralyzed. Depth charges gone. The sticks of high explosives tumbled from the bomb bay, perfectly illuminated targets. They bracketed the submarine, exploding in towering geysers of white water. The light held for exactly 10 seconds, then snapped off, plunging the world back into darkness as the Wellington banked hard to escape the blast. When they circled back, the ocean was churning. The Luigi Torelli was battered, crippled, and leaking oil. It would not dive again. It was eventually forced to limp toward the Spanish coast, where it was interned. The Wellington returned to base at dawn. Lee was waiting on the tarmac, pacing, a half-smoked cigarette in his hand. As Greswell climbed down from the cockpit, he looked at the anxious inventor. He didn't salute. He just grinned. "It works, Humphrey. It bloody well works." Lee filed his report. Device functioned perfectly, target engaged. He thought he had won. He thought the evidence was undeniable. He was wrong. 2 days later, he was summoned to Coastal Command headquarters. He walked into the briefing room expecting congratulations. Instead, he walked into an ambush. The room was filled with Air Ministry engineers, Admiralty representatives, and senior staff officers. They were furious. The senior engineer threw Lee's report onto the table. "Squadron leader," the man sneered, "you have violated 3 separate Air Ministry orders. You have installed uncertified heavy equipment on a combat aircraft. And for what? You damaged an Italian submarine? Our destroyers damage submarines every week. You have compromised the safety of a Wellington bomber to achieve a result that is statistically insignificant." Another officer chimed in. "The weight penalty reduces the bomb load, the drag reduces the range, and this battery pack is a fire hazard. We are recommending that the device be removed immediately and the program terminated." Lee stood alone in the center of the room. He felt the weight of the 400,000 tons of sinking ships pressing on him. He looked at the men in their clean uniforms who fought war with slide rules and regulations. He opened his mouth to argue, to scream that they were throwing away the only chance they had, when a voice cut through the noise from the back of the room. "Sit down, gentlemen." The room froze. Air Chief Marshal Philippe Joubert de la Ferté had entered. He was the new Commander-in-Chief of Coastal Command, a man who had been in the job for less than a week. He walked to the front of the room, picked up Leigh's report, and put on his glasses. He read it in silence. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like gunshots. Joubert looked up, ignoring the engineers, and locked eyes with Humphrey Lee. "Squadron leader, tell me the truth. Not the engineering specs, the operational truth. If I give you the planes, can you kill them?" Lee didn't blink. "Sir, if you give me a squadron, I will close the Bay of Biscay to the U-boats. I will turn the night against them. They won't be able to surface to breathe without us seeing them." Joubert turned to the complaining engineer. "What is our current kill rate at night?" "Well, sir, with current equipment, it is approximately 0.3%, but—" 0.3, Joubert repeated. "And this officer just achieved a 100% illumination rate on his first try." Joubert dropped the report on the table. "I don't care about the regulations. I don't care about the weight penalty. I care about sinking Germans. Squadron Leader Lee, you are promoted to Wing Commander effective immediately. You will take command of 172 Squadron. You will fit every Wellington you can get your hands on with this light, and you will do it by yesterday." He turned to the stunned room. "The discussion is over. Get this man his batteries." Humphrey Lee had won the battle against his own side. Now he had to win the war against the toughest admiral in the Nazi hierarchy. He had the green light, he had the squadron, and he had a deadline. But as the first modified Wellingtons rolled out of the hangars, the pilots were still terrified. They needed proof. They needed a leader who wasn't just an inventor, and in July 1942, they got one. Not from a British veteran, but from a 22-year-old American volunteer named Wiley B. Howell, who was about to take Lee's invention and turn the Bay of Biscay into a slaughterhouse. July 1942. The mood at RAF Chivener was tense. Wing Commander Humphrey Lee had won his political battle, but his Leigh Light was still unproven as a reliable weapon of war. The modified Wellingtons of 172 Squadron sat on the tarmac, their bellies swollen with the heavy, retractable turrets. The pilots were wary. They were being asked to fly at 50 feet above the ocean in pitch blackness, trusting a car headlight to save them from crashing into the sea or being shot down by flak. The skepticism was palpable. The experts were still whispering that it was a gimmick, a suicide contraption that would get good men killed. Lee needed a kill. He didn't just need a damaged submarine, he needed a confirmed sinking. He needed to show the Admiralty that the night no longer offered sanctuary to the U-boats. The man who would deliver that proof wasn't a veteran RAF ace, but a 22-year-old American volunteer named Pilot Officer Wiley B. Howell. Howell was young, aggressive, and perhaps just naive enough to trust Lee's contraption implicitly. On the night of July 5, 1942, he taxied his Wellington out for a patrol over the Bay of Biscay. The mission was routine: hunt for U-boats transiting from France to the Atlantic. The intelligence reports indicated that U-boat traffic was heavy. Admiral Dönitz, confident in the safety of darkness, was sending his wolves out in packs. At 23:34 hours, the radar operator in Howell's plane called out a contact. It was a solid blip, running fast on the surface. "Combat stations," Howell ordered. He throttled back the engines to reduce noise and began a slow, gliding descent. The Wellington ghosted through the night air. Inside the fuselage, the crew waited in the red-lit gloom. The radar operator counted down the range. 2 miles, 1 mile, half mile. The radar screen clutter began to bloom, the signal drowning in the noise of the waves. They were blind. This was the moment where hundreds of previous attacks had failed. Howell held his nerve, flying on instruments,
trusting the math. At 50 feet of altitude, with the altimeter needle trembling near zero, he gave the order. "Light on!" The Leigh Light dropped from the fuselage and ignited. The beam hit the water and swept forward. In an instant, the black ocean was replaced by a brilliant, blinding white stage. And there, center stage, was U-502. It was a Type IXC submarine, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Jürgen von Rosenstiel. They were returning from a successful patrol in the Caribbean, their crew relaxed, running on the surface to recharge batteries. They never saw the plane. They never heard it. 1 second, they were cruising in the safety of the dark Atlantic night. The next, they were engulfed in a light brighter than the sun. The psychological impact was devastating.
The German lookouts on the bridge were blinded instantly. They couldn't see the aircraft. They could only see the source of the light, a burning eye of God descending upon them. They froze. There was no time to man the flak guns, no time to seal the hatch, no time to dive. Howell's bombardier had a perfect illuminated target. "Bomb's gone!" A stick of 4 depth charges tumbled into the beam. They bracketed the U-boat perfectly, straddling the pressure hull. The water erupted in towering columns of spray. As the Wellington roared over the submarine, Howell banked hard, cutting the light to plunge the scene back into darkness and spoiling the aim of any surviving gunners. When they circled back and dropped a flare, the sea was empty of ships. There was only a spreading slick of oil and debris. U-502 had been broken in half. All 52 hands were lost. It was the first confirmed kill using the Leigh Light. Howell returned to base and filed his report. Humphrey Lee read it, and for the first time in months, he slept soundly. The dam had broken. 2 nights later, on July 7th, Squadron Leader Jefferson Greswell, the pilot who had flown the very first test mission, caught U-159 on the surface. He illuminated it, attacked, and crippled it so badly it had to limp back to port, never to sail again. On July 12th, another Wellington caught U-159 again, finishing the job. On July 13th, U-751 was illuminated and obliterated. The Bay of Biscay had turned into a shooting gallery. The statistics, once so grim for the Allies, began to reverse with terrifying speed. In the first 6 months of 1942, the RAF had managed to sink almost nothing in the bay. By August, they were slaughtering U-boats at a rate that panicked the German High Command. The reports filtering back to U-boat headquarters in Lorient, France, were filled with dread. Survivors spoke of das Licht des Todes, the light of death. They described a weapon that gave no warning. You would be standing watch, staring into the dark, and suddenly you were exposed, naked and dead. The morale of the U-boat crews began to crack. The darkness, their one true ally, had betrayed them. Admiral Dönitz was baffled. He couldn't understand how the British were suddenly able to see in the dark. At first, he suspected treason. Then he suspected a new type of radar. Finally, as the survivor reports piled up, he realized the terrifying simplicity of the solution. The British weren't seeing in the dark, they were erasing it. Dönitz made a desperate decision. He issued a standing order that changed the entire dynamic of the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats will no longer surface at night to recharge batteries, the order read. All recharging must be done during daylight hours. It was a tactical surrender. By forcing his submarines to surface during the day, Dönitz was exposing them to conventional visual attacks by Allied aircraft and destroyers. He was trading the terror of the Leigh Light for the danger of the daylight. The U-boats were now trapped. If they surfaced at night, the Leigh Light found them. If they surfaced by day, the Liberators and Sunderlands found them. The Valley of Death lived up to its name. The kills mounted. The Leigh Light was fitted to Liberators, Catalinas, and eventually U.S. Navy aircraft. It became standard equipment. But the ultimate vindication of Humphrey Lee's illegal invention came on the night of June 6, 1944, D-Day. As the massive Allied invasion fleet crossed the Channel to Normandy, the U-boat fleet was ordered to intercept and destroy the landing ships at all costs. It was a suicide mission, a mass charge of submarines into the teeth of the Allied defenses. Guarding the flanks of the invasion corridor were the aircraft of Coastal Command, prowling the dark waters with their Leigh Lights. Flying Officer Kenneth Moore, a Canadian pilot in a B-24 Liberator, was patrolling the western approaches to the channel. At 0200 hours, he got a radar contact. He ran the drill: throttle back, descend, wait for the blind spot. Light on. U-629 was illuminated. Moore dropped his depth charges. The sub disintegrated. Moore didn't even have time to celebrate. 20 minutes later, his radar operator yelled, "Another contact, 5 miles." Moore turned the heavy bomber. He repeated the approach. He flipped the switch. U-373 was caught in the beam. Moore attacked again. In less than 30 minutes, one pilot, using one invention, had destroyed 2 submarines and saved countless soldiers on the transport ships. The U-boat offensive against the D-Day landings was crushed before it began. By the end of the war, the Leigh Light had played a direct role in sinking over 200 German U-boats. It saved an estimated 400,000 Allied lives. It secured the supply lines that allowed Britain to survive and America to project its power into Europe. It was, arguably, the single most cost-effective weapon of the entire war. A car headlight and a battery pack that defeated the Kriegsmarine. And what of Humphrey Lee? He never sought fame. He never wrote a memoir. After the war, the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors recognized his contribution, giving him a modest financial award. But the public largely forgot him. He retired from the RAF as an Air Commodore and faded into quiet civilian life, the quintessential gray man. Years later, at a reunion of 172 Squadron, an aging Wiley Howell, now a captain in the U.S. Navy and a decorated veteran, spotted Lee across the room. He walked over to the man who had been called a crank, a maverick, and a fool by the Air Ministry experts. "Wing Commander," Howell said, shaking his hand. "You know, back in '42, none of us thought that damn dustbin would work. We thought you were trying to kill us." Lee smiled, the same quiet, stubborn smile he had worn when facing down the admirals. "And yet," he said softly, "you are here." "Yes, sir," Howell replied. "We're here. And so are a hell of a lot of sailors who don't even know your name." Humphrey Lee died in 1980. His invention is now a museum piece, a strange-looking contraption of lenses and wires sitting in the RAF Museum in London. To the casual observer, it looks like junk, a scavenged searchlight bolted into a metal can. But to those who know the history, it is a monument to the most American of virtues, even if displayed by a Brit: the refusal to accept impossible as an answer. The experts said it couldn't be done. The regulations said it wasn't allowed. The math said it wouldn't work. Humphrey Lee built it anyway. And in the darkest hours of the war, when the world was hanging by a thread, he didn't just curse the darkness. He turned on a light.